Well, that was a very stimulating program. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was terrific. Thanks. There's a lot of interest in the future. And our next session will be focusing on the future. At least that's what the theme of their session is, the future of global economic growth and cooperation. And if our panel would begin to assemble, please. Our moderator is Bill Rhodes, known to us all and to the world as Banker to the World, and he deserves that title for sure. He's had an extraordinary career in the front lines of financial crises all over the world. Been very effective. He's out of the private sector, but has been extremely valuable to governmental efforts to deal with the crises that have come up, particularly in the Latin American side, but across the globe. Bill, were you all assembled? Anyone missing? Yeah. Okay. Who's missing? Oh, Gail.
No, Gail's here.
Okay. Nice to have you here. Thank you. And with that, Bill, I should also mention Bill has been a very strong supporter of the Bretton Woods Committee and is a member of our advisory council. And with that, the baton is yours.
Thank you very much, Dick. I think we've got a great panel here today, and I'll start there with Mohamed El-Erian. You've got his biography, but everyone knows Mohamed. And we talk about Bretton Woods. He had a stint in the IMF, and we all remember him from PIMCO. He's now a senior advisor of Allianz. John McFarlane is one of the outstanding bankers in the world today. He spent over 40 years doing it. He and I worked together at one point in time. We're very lucky that he's here. Gail Kelly is also one of the senior bankers. She ran Westpac, and certainly if you talk about women in finance, there's nobody with more experience or seniority than Gail. And she and I have worked together on a number of projects on culture and conduct for the Group of 30. And we're very pleased to have Vanessa Rubio-Marquez with us here again. She was with us in April. She's the Deputy Secretary of Finance and Public Credit in Mexico, which is a very important role in that country. And she's been in similar positions at Social Development and the Ministry of Foreign Relations. I think we heard from our speaker from the IMF about the view of the IMF that the world economy is improving over the past year from what we've seen in the last few years. But we still have a number of problems out there, without a doubt. There are many challenges, whether we're talking about starting with the so-called Western democracies, with the populism and nationalism we've seen in Western Europe and here in the United States, the problems in Asia and the Korean Peninsula, and an event is taking place in a few days in China, which I think is perhaps the most important political and economic event that will occur this year, which is the 19th Party Congress on the 18th of October, when Xi Jinping is basically going to set out his plans for the next 5 years or perhaps longer than that, as the strongest leader of China since at least Deng Xiaoping, if not Mao Zedong. And I think we've all learned over the past few years that what happens in China counts. Not only it's the world's second largest economy, but as far as not only an economic power, but as a political power, is advancing very rapidly. And Gail will have something particularly to say on Asia. We have a lot of challenges in the trade area. We have Brexit. I'm sure that John will want to say something about that. I think Vanessa will talk to us somewhat about the challenges of what's going on with NAFTA. But certainly the world has changed a lot since we were here a year ago, particularly in the area of trade. And I think when we take a look at some of these changes, the rise of populism and nationalism, the growth of the importance of China, situations like the Korean Peninsula, which I think people tend to feel, will get resolved because that's the way we've always treated North Korea. Having spent a number of years involved with Korea, I'm not so sure this time. So these are some of the things that I think we will be talking about on this sort of backdrop of a lot of challenges. And so what I'd like to do is start with Mohamed as how he sees the world moving ahead with some of these challenges based on his own experience. And of course, Mohamed has written a lot on central banks and how central banks have kept the world moving for the last 7 or 8 years coming out of the Great Recession. Mohamed?
Thank you. Until Bill called on me, I thought how wonderful it is to be here and see so many friends and acquaintances. But when he called on me to go first, all that good feeling dissipated very quickly. I think what you just said, what we heard in the panel before, what we've heard so far in these annual meetings, and what we're going to hear over the next few days is what I call the yes, but. Yes, things are better, but there's a whole list of things that we're worried about. And relative to 6 months ago, what's really fascinating is both the yes and the but have gotten bigger, right? Which is very unusual. And that speaks a little bit to this concept of radical uncertainty, or like Chair Bernanke's unusual uncertainty. So the yes, you've heard about it. There's 3 elements. 1 is a pickup in global growth. 2, it's synchronized, with the exception of the UK, but it's synchronized, which makes things easier in theory. And 3 is it's happening in the context of extremely low financial volatility. Okay, these 3 things are important. Why? Because they speak to consumption, they speak to investment, and they speak to the wealth effect. So if you were just to look at the yes part, you would get excited because you have the ability to have a virtuous cycle up here. But then there's the but. And the list of buts is getting bigger. There's a whole host of economic buts, starting with the most fundamental aspect, which is we understand less about advanced economies today than we have had during my whole career. We're confused by productivity trends. Chair Yellen talked about the mystery of inflation. You have ECB President Mario Draghi urging the unions to increase their wage demands. We don't understand well wage determination. The Philip curve has flattened. There's a whole set of fundamental economic relationships that we don't understand. And when you don't understand this fundamental economic relationship, you get nervous about extrapolating too far the cyclical improvement. Add to that that technology is probably impacting all 3, and we don't fully understand how technology is changing the rules of how an economy functions, and how basic things like you've heard before about basic income, how should we think about these things? Add to that what I call the adding up problem, that we have, and this is a particularly important context to speak about this, we have a global adding up problem. Exchange rates. Virtually no country or block of countries wants to live with a more appreciated exchange rate. So the currency market becomes a hot potato. You have the currency exchange, the higher the appreciator. No, I don't want it, you take it, right? 2, you just heard, fundamental trade relationships are being questioned. And then The other element is the implication of low financial volatility. And the implication of low financial volatility is excessive risk-taking. So there's a risk of financial instability down the road. Now notice, I haven't talked about geopolitics. I haven't talked about politics. This is all within the context of economics, finance. So yes, up here, but up here. Now, depending on whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, you will have different views on what will prevail. But it has to be reconciled. And it's not financial markets that are going to reconcile this. It's the politicians. We have a set of policies on which there is discussion here, there's discussion in Europe, that can reconcile the yes, make the yes better, and reduce the buts. But if the political system does not respond to these set of policies, then the yes will fade and the buts will go up front. Now, I'll leave you with the notion that this is a very uncomfortable distribution to be in. We like operating in the belly of a distribution. We don't like operating with fat tails. Fat tails, yes. Fat tails, but. And when markets face that, to answer the question that was posed today, is they'll go back to the belly of the curve, even though the belly of the curve is not where the action is going to be. Thank you.
I think, Mohamed, I think most people give credit to you for the use of the phrase, the new normal. And what you're putting out to us is we have left the new normal, and it's not clear where we're going at this stage of the game. John, you want to comment from your point of view how you see things as running one of the largest banks, as executive chairman in the world?
It sounds like the new abnormal. I mean, as I get, Bill said I was a colleague. I mean, he was my boss, to be frank. So that as I get older, I tend to try and stand back from it a bit more. Because I don't really fix the day-to-day problems. I actually try and take the organization where it needs to go long term. And a number of things are causing me to reflect. The first is that there is a two-speed set of economies in two respects. One is the rapid growth of the emerging markets and the slow growth and recovery of the Western economies, which faltered as a consequence of the global financial crisis and artificially stimulated the underlying economies, but then are left with the need to get out of the excess asset positions that the central banks are holding, which inevitably is an uncertain future because normally in these events it causes some dislocation. For example, as I said to somebody last night, that in the last 50 years, the Fed has had 13 occasions to tighten, and in 10 of those occasions, it caused a recession. And so if you're a betting person, what would you bet on? And whereas inexorably, the emerging markets, the younger economies, those with low per capita GDPs, you can easily see those per capita GDPs doubling, whether it's China, India, Indonesia, and so forth. And you get this compounding effect with, whilst it's all improving, you get this two-tier compounding with very large compounding rates in those new economies and very slow compounding rates in the developing economies. And you see where that's going to go. It's going to end up in a very uncomfortable place for the developed economies. You then get this two-speed economy associated with the digital economy relative to traditional infrastructural activity, our existing business models. So, for example, I've just spent, the last 20 years turning around dealing financial institutions. And basically, the model that we kind of use is, here's what we've got, how do we make that good? Whereas, again, reflecting on it, if we didn't have what we've got and started again, we wouldn't actually do what we do today. We'd actually do something radically different. So, for example, I said also last night, if the average major bank in the world has $60 billion of capital employed in its existing proposition, And that proposition, by degree, is either wonderful or problematic. But the main bank has 50 billion. Imagine if we started something new with 50 billion, what would you do with it? You'd put it into something different. And so the challenge for these existing propositions is how do you convert yourself from what you've got today, recognizing that inexorably that's going to be tomorrow. A good example is Alibaba's subsidiary, which is Ant Financial, which is the largest online payment system in the world. It's going to go to market next year, and it's postulating a IPO value of 60 to 100 billion US as a starting point. And, whereas Barclays is 50 billion US. And so you can see that the threat of fintech, the threat of the new economy, particularly these new business models, highly technological models, is going to reshape the future of a number of industries, but particularly banking. And in that respect, if you take the largest bank in the world, which is ICBC by market cap, right, it is half the market cap of Apple. So if you go back in time, market cap of Apple was about 15 billion US. It's now 600 odd billion US. And so the technology firms are outstripping the traditional business models. And therefore, one of the solutions that we are going to have to embrace is that we're going to have to reshape ourselves into technology companies that do a bit of banking rather than banks that use a bit of technology. Now, I'll stop there so that other people can speak.
You put your finger on one of the biggest challenges of the financial system, particularly the banking system, with AI, the whole fintech revolution that's taking place. You just take a look at Alibaba. I could run through all these companies that are rising around the world, and PayPal, whatever. And if the banking system isn't careful, they'll suddenly lose their consumer franchise worldwide. And I think there's a lot of underestimation of this revolution that's going on, and it's moving so quickly. And that's one of the problems with the regulators. I don't think the regulators have been able to capture that as we're moving forward. And I think it's something we all need to follow very carefully. Otherwise, it's going to overtake everything. Gail, you have such a diverse background, and this is something you're interested in also. But I'd ask you to talk a little bit about not only Australia, but about Asia, because there's no doubt that Asia is rising, not just China, but Asia in general. And it would be very good, I think, for our audience to hear some of your thoughts.
Thanks very much, Bill, and hello, everyone. I must say it's a great honor and delight to be here, so thanks very much. Yes, so I'll focus my comments on Asia, what's happening with regard to economic integration in Asia, and really what's changed over the last 12 months and what the forces of change are going forward. And let me start by saying that the business of economic integration and growth in Asia is alive and well. And we've already discussed the importance of Asian growth to the world economy. I'd have to say the U.S.'s America First policy definitely has created some uncertainty and some readjustment that's been required as a consequence of that. As we all know, America's position in Asia with Obama's pivot to that region was much more than just an economic situation. It's a strategic position that America was taking with regard to the Asia-Pacific region, and really underpinned the security and the stability of the region, and by and large was welcomed by the region for those very reasons, the stability, the security. So the US withdrawing in the way that they have has certainly left a vacuum, has left a space. And of course, inevitably, others will step up and fill that space, and actually that's what's happened here. So China has really stepped up to fill that space. And I'll give you a couple of examples. The best one, probably in the trade space, is to do with the trade agreements. So RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Program, was being developed in conjunction, really, with the TPP. It came a little after, but more or less in conjunction. That has now had a whole new lease in life. China was not included in the TPP, or was not involved there, but it is included in the RCEP, and has taken the leadership role and the patron role of driving that, and it's moving, and there's momentum behind it. Just on the TPP, I should mention America's withdrawal out of the TPP hasn't actually killed it as people perhaps thought it would. the 11 other players that are there, countries that are there. It's now called the TPP 11. And they are sort of determined to try and at least carry this forward and press on with the TPP, because although clearly the economic benefit is significantly impacted by the US pulling out, the TPP was always about much more than that. It really was about creating governance standards in a range of areas that would actually be beneficial for countries in their trade scenarios. So governance standards around things like environment, intellectual property, and labor. So really important ancillary components to the TPP. Now, some would say that, some nations would say they're playing a long game with the TPP, hoping that in a forthcoming administration that the US may perhaps come back. We'll wait and see. Certainly hope that that's the case. But others are also saying, you know what, we don't want the US to pick countries off in terms of bilateral agreements with countries, so we're going to stick together. So this notion of multilateral agreements, as you can see, is alive and well. The RCEP is progressing. There's momentum behind it with China leading it, and the TPP hasn't fallen away, and the 11 leaders, TPP 11, are pushing forward with that. Perhaps the best example of how China has stepped up with the US pulling away is with regard to the One Belt, One Road initiative, which is a very, very ambitious, breathtakingly ambitious initiative, stretching from west to east, road systems, maritime systems, many trillions of dollars involved in infrastructure that China is working with neighboring countries. This goes all the way from Africa, Pakistan, Iran, neighboring countries, and big programs are underway already in Laos and in Vietnam and in Pakistan with this One Belt, One Road. Now, clearly, it's an economic integration program, and the leadership of China have described it as such. They've spoken about it in terms of developing world peace and prosperity. But clearly, it's a power play as well, and it's quite imperialistic almost in its vision and in its approach. And so there are a number of countries that are understandably wary of this particular initiative. And just to name one obvious one, it would be India. Let me just mention one other thing about China that's sometimes underappreciated, and that's the extraordinary innovation that's actually occurring there with regard to technology. It's interesting to note that if you look at the R&D dollars that are going into China, they're the second largest in the world. And a recent UBS publication forecasts that the dollars will be more than the US is putting into R&D in 2018. Patents have gone up tenfold over the last 10 years. And very importantly, this whole focus on education. So in China, the 2.8 million graduates in science and engineering per annum. Now, that's 5 times the number of science and engineering graduates that are coming out of the US. So there's amazing focus on innovation and setting up hubs and environments across China that's stimulating this type of innovation. And it's private companies that are doing this and private prototyping. So there's wealth that's being created in this way as well. It's quite an interesting juxtaposition, the privatization of these and the openness inherently of an internet sort of sitting alongside or as part and parcel of a country, a Chinese communist country. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I saw the Wall Street Journal today spoke of the state looking to perhaps ask for 1% investment in these companies. But really interesting developments that's going on there. Let me just say a few words about Australia before I finish. So Australia is a strong advocate for trade. Australia is an open country. It's got a flexible exchange rate. And indeed, it's in its sort of 25th or 26th year of uninterrupted economic growth. And clearly, its geographic position, the flexibility of the economy, the resources that are part and parcel of the economy is part of that. But this openness to trade and this advocacy for multilateral agreements and regional agreements is very much part of that. It's interesting, too, that Australian people are largely pro-globalization. So a recent Lowy Institute piece of research said that nearly 80% of people recognize or say that globalization is good for the country. Australia likes to have strong relationships with both China and with the US, and long may that continue. I think it's really important that we do that. Of course, populism is manifesting itself in Australia as well, because Mr. and Mrs. Middle Class Australia feel that the benefits of globalization aren't being equally shared or shared appropriately. And so you'll find Mr. and Mrs. Middle Class Australia who are looking at their wages and saying they are not growing. And they're looking at where wealth is being created elsewhere. They'll look at property and say, I can't afford it, and my children will never afford it. My children will be worse off with regard to property affordability. They look at governments and they say, I'm not sure that we trust governments to deal with the big issues of climate change and energy policy, and look what's happening to our electricity prices. They look at big business and say we don't trust the motives of big business at all. They're self-interested. And as a consequence, we don't support tax cuts to big business that would make big business more competitive globally and put investment back into the country. And then they look at jobs and say, we're really concerned about this, all this hype of innovation. Well, that sounds terrific, but what's it going to mean for me and my job? And by the way, I don't have the skills to retrain, or haven't been given the skills to deal with jobs that may emerge elsewhere. So this is a growing concern within the Australian context. What helps Australia, though, is it's got a very strong redistributive system and a strong social safety net system with universal health care, with access to education, disability schemes, and social welfare programs. I think this is really important. Now, governments are going to have to do more, and businesses are certainly going to have to do more to take people with them on this journey. But Australia certainly is a huge advocate for economic growth, and I think may have something of a model that may be useful for other countries.
Thank you very much. Well, you've picked up very much on what John was saying about the rapid changes of technology vis-a-vis where China's going. And it would seem to me that after this 19th Party Congress and the renewed empowerment of Xi Jinping, I think we're going to see that even accelerate more. And I don't think that's perceived enough in the so-called West, whether it be the United States or Western Europe, what's actually going on there. And John, you're also one who spent a number of years in Asia in that regard. Before I come back from additional questions, I want Vanessa to talk to us about how she sees things going in NAFTA, Mexico, and also one of the interesting possibilities is Mexico is a major member of the Pacific Alliance. And the Pacific Alliance is now thinking about an arrangement with Mercosur, particularly since Venezuela has been pushed out, and with a new government of Macri in Argentina and the interest that Brazil has in doing it. So what many people see is that you could have a merger of the Pacific Alliance with Mercosur, which would basically form an enormous economic bloc. So you might want to talk about that as well as how you see NAFTA moving. Thank you.
Of course. Thanks for having me again. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Yes, what I think it's relevant to put in context is the Mexico case as a case of resilience and as a case of strength. We could have had more shocks in the last year. We started as any other country having the volatility and the nervousness derived from Brexit, but then, of course, also from the less growth than expected in the major economies, but mainly in the U.S., and mainly the decrease in growth in the U.S. industrial and manufacturing sector, which obviously is the pulling factor for most of our exports. We also have the shock of oil in two different parts, one being price. Last time I was at the Ministry of Finance, which was 5 years ago, oil prices were over $100 per barrel, and now last year we started below $20 per barrel. So that's a big shock for an economy like Mexico. The other oil shock was in relation to platform. We used to produce 3.4 barrels when Cantarell was already was also an option. Now it's not anymore. We started producing 2.5 million at the beginning of this administration 4.5 years ago, and now it's the first year that we have been producing below 2 million barrels per day. Another shock we obviously had was the U.S. elections and the uncertainty that came out of it. The kind of relationship we would build with the U.S. in terms of trade, in terms of security, in terms of cooperation, in terms of migration. So that was a big question mark too that has somehow been anchored nowadays with the negotiation, the renegotiation and the modernization of NAFTA. What I can tell you about that is that it's moving forward. There is a lot of noise around it, but basically the majority of the negotiations, I was in charge of heading the negotiations for the financial sector for the first round, are as any other negotiations I have been in, and I was part of the, Mexico and EU negotiations back in the 1990s, and the Pacific Alliance more recently, and they have been moving forward as they should and as you would expect, no? Many agreements, but also many disagreements that are being, blurred as we move forward. The real question there is, what would a gain mean for Mexico, the U.S., and Canada, and if we are able to combine what our expectations are with the time frame we have in order to be able to have a concrete advancement by the end of the year or beginning of next year, because obviously in the case of Mexico we have political constraints, which is the general elections, and also the U.S. will have midterm elections next year. So those are constraints that need to be considered in that regard. Another shock which I think was very important is in January, as you might know, we liberalized the gasoline prices in Mexico. It wasn't the most popular measure to take, being a politician and being at the Ministry of Finance, but it was the right decision to make. It was only Mexico, North Korea, Belarus, and Venezuela, the only countries who still controlled oil prices. And it had to be, a floating commodity as any other commodity or goods or service in the economy. So now it has been better understood and better anchored. And lastly, we also had a natural disaster shock. First, a big hurricane, and then 2 big earthquakes. So if this is not a story of resilience, I don't know what other story is. And the question is, what underlies this strength? And this strength I see in a 3-tier approach. First of all, it's fiscal policy. We have maintained our goals. We have maintained fiscal consolidation, which was a huge commitment made back in 2014. We are consolidating. We're having less debt in relation to GDP than before. We are spending less in terms of government. So we're moving forward in terms of our fiscal goals and our fiscal policy. Also, a good and sound monetary and timely monetary policy, who is anchoring inflation, basically as a result of the liberalization of oil prices at the beginning of the year, but now inflation is coming in a downward trend. And finally, the implementation of structural reforms. Structural reforms are the major legacy of this administration, and obviously energy, telecom, financial, education reforms have been implemented and are giving high expectations in terms of investments. 90 billion, for example, in the energy sector, 9 billion in the telecom sector, 2 million for the special economic zones. So that is why, and those are the reasons behind this narrative of strength and resilience that the Mexican economy has. And obviously one of the challenges ahead is trade. Trade, because we're still very focused in trade with North America. 68% of our trade is still developed within North America. But a very relevant data that I want to leave with you is that only 44% of our trade goes through NAFTA rules. The rest is non-NAFTA rules, which is mainly other free trade agreements, or WTO most favored nation. So that's a very relevant data that we should bear in mind. Not everything goes through the NAFTA rulings. And we're also going through a strategy of further diversification. Pacific Alliance definitely, but also the possibility of having a reduced TPP group of countries, and also obviously starting negotiations with main Mercosur partners, basically Brazil and Argentina. So diversification is something we're pursuing at a higher speed, and we wish to continue in that regard, because Mexico's economic model and this strength and this success that I have been telling you about is based on free trade and is based on the free flow of capitals as well and the free flow of investment.
Just one additional point before I move on. You have Prime Minister Trudeau now talking in Mexico, having just been in the United States. And as you mentioned, you have elections coming up in July next year, presidential elections. How optimistic, and I may be putting you on the spot here, how optimistic are you that some agreement can be reached before, a few months before the election? Because then it's almost impossible for any government until the election takes place to do it. And I know there's a time fuse here. And I think so many people in the United States don't seem to understand that. They think you can just go on and on and on. But political reality in Mexico says you can't. So I would put that to you if I can get you to answer that one.
No, I think it would depend on the degree of ambition of the three countries. I mean, if the most ambitious you want to be, I mean, you need more time in order for that to be a proper negotiation. If you want to anchor your ambitions and get 1, 2, or 3 specific deliverables coming out of the renegotiation of NAFTA, then that's doable. But you have indeed, we have indeed elections in July, but also a new government will be elected in July, and the government that will enter, it enters until the 1st of December. So there is another window of opportunity. So you have the first window of opportunity, you have a second window of opportunity, and more governments will follow in Mexico. Then you can have more time if you wish to go further negotiating over time. I mean, these kind of negotiations take 24 months, 40 months. It's not something that you negotiate from one day to the other. But if we want to anchor ambitions and come about into a concrete deliverable before the first trimester of next year, I think that's doable for the for the old government, current government in Mexico.
There are so many questions I'd like to ask you, Mohamed, but one of the things I'm going to ask you about is to say something about the Middle East, because Dick Debs and I always point out that at these meetings here in Washington, 2 areas tend to be ignored, the Middle East and Africa. And if there's anyone who can talk about the Middle East, it's you. So I hope you don't mind me asking you about that, because I think it's an area of the world that's so important strategically, economically, politically, etc. So maybe if you could say a few words, and having advised President Obama on some areas of development in the area, maybe you can have a few words you might want to say about that.
Thanks, but it's very hard to talk about the Middle East because there's so many different trends going on in the Middle East. I think the 2 most striking change in the last 12 months are beneficial ones, and certainly ones that I didn't anticipate to happen. First, and picking up on what Vanessa said, is low oil prices has gotten the GCC to think very seriously as to what's ahead. And in the Saudi Vision 2030, but also you see it across the GCC, there's a lot more thinking about the post-oil world. And it's much more advanced, it's much more ambitious, it's much more detailed than anything that has come before. The second is what happened in Egypt. I mean, Bill and I grew up in a world where you couldn't even mention the exchange rate in Egypt. Now, Egypt operates with a free-floating exchange rate. Reserves are back up to 44 billion, a record level. And the mentality has changed in terms of there are no longer sacred prices like there were before. So as much as we read a lot of negative things going on in the Middle East, and there certainly are a lot of things to worry about in Yemen, in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, there's also a policy revolution going on that certainly I would not have projected 12 months ago.
John, maybe you might want to say something, and it's a tough subject, but it's so important not only to the UK and Europe, but I think to the world, because you can argue which was the most important financial center. If you're in Europe, you say it's London, but let's say London and New York. But certainly London had no rival in Europe. And one of the questions that comes out of Brexit is what's going to happen to that center. I think it's so important for the area politically, economically, but also for the financial system worldwide, for the banking system worldwide. So maybe you might want to comment, because I know you've been in the center of this, trying to make sure that a decent solution and resolution comes out of all of this.
Britain has had an uneasy relationship with Europe from the beginning. It's never been quite comfortable being fully emerged. And particularly with Brussels and the invasion of small regulations, annoying regulations on food-type products. And therefore, Britain's had an important free trade agreement with the EU, which is to its disadvantage, because last year Britain had a trade deficit of about 40 billion, of which it was a deficit of 100 on goods and a 60 billion surplus on services. And of course, the UK economy is 80% services if you include government. And so services and financial services is really important to the economy. Financial services and professional related services is 15% of GDP. And so what happens here is really quite important. Britain got annoyed with, not with the common market so much, because it's a free market orientated political situation. What it got annoyed with was implicitly, even though nobody really discusses this, that Europe seems to be on a course of political and economic union. United States of Europe. Again, nobody's discussed it. It's never been debated. But if you look at what's actually the evidence for it, you can see it's naturally heading in that direction. And that increasingly has made Britain uncomfortable. I think the other aspect of this is what Gail touched on, which is the underclass of these Western economies whose real incomes have declined, and they're really struggling with life. And they're pushing back on everything. And in particular, when given a chance to push back on something, for example, such as a referendum, it doesn't actually matter what the subject is, they're going to push back. And so they've pushed back on this, and you end up with Brexit. Nobody anticipated that. The government was pro-remaining, although there were elements within its own party which were for leaving. And it's created a very chaotic and uncertain situation, because we now are having to exit something that's been to the advantage of the City of London. Many firms, particularly the American firms, have gone to the UK explicitly, not to deal with the UK market per se, but as an access to the EU. And so I'm actually the financial sector chairman in the UK. And so we're trying to, essentially, I find myself as the chairman of Barclays, my prime task is to argue for the American banks, to try and keep the foreign banks in London and to avoid unnecessary dislocation. The issue is this, that there are really two parts to this. There are those things that should, over time, be in the domestic area of the EU. And therefore, they should move. But there are many things that should not move, because it's about competitive advantage, and that competitive advantage sits either with London or with New York. A good example is swaps clearing. 95% of interest rate swaps are cleared in London, 550 trillion a year. They are multi-currency netted so that the amount of capital that's invested is reduced, and therefore the price of the clearing is very low. That cannot be replicated. And yet, there is this political will, for example, to have euro clearing move to within the Eurozone. Now, there's a problem with that economically, in that if you move euro clearing, you weaken an existing system, make that globally more expensive, but you also create a system that's completely uneconomic, because it doesn't have multi-currency netting. the other choice is to create a new multi-currency netting system in the new areas in Paris or somewhere. And of course, you're then going to have competition between multi-currency netting areas that's going to lead to an increase in the price, and therefore the efficiency and more complex and more expensive risk management. So it doesn't actually make any sense for anybody for that to move. The same is true of these big dealing rooms in London. The capital markets sit there. There are no material capital markets inside the EU. Therefore, that stuff should not move. Or if it's going to move, it should gravitate over a very long period of time. And so what we're worried about is making sure that the end of this is sensible. And therefore, the thing we're most worried about is this negotiation that's taking place, because it's been designed by the EU to deal with the exit first and what happens afterwards second. Now, imagine you're making an investment as a company or an individual, and you're going to agree the price first, and then one day you're going to talk about whether there are any benefits or not. I mean, there's no way on earth you do it. You've actually got to deal with each together. And of course, that's to the advantage of European economies that want to attract politically things from London, and to the disadvantage through the uncertainty that that creates, because you don't know whether things will be retained in London or not. So we've had some difficulty with the politicians, frankly, in the UK, because there are many politicians that want out at all costs. And therefore that's been a problem, because trying to get sensible discussion going, it's been easy with the Treasury, but it's been more difficult elsewhere politically. What we have engineered is essentially a device, which is, given that nobody's left the EU, and this 2-year period has been designed by the EU to make sure nobody leaves, okay, because it's so difficult. And therefore, if that is enforced, there's going to be significant dislocation and potentially financial instability associated with that being enacted. And so we've argued very strongly and successfully, at least within the UK, for there to be a 2-year extension period where effectively we retain the benefits of it, paying the price of that, but also paying the price of the free movement of people and the European Court of Justice and so forth, in order that sensible outcomes are arranged, which will come in one of 3 forms. One form is, look, there are stuff that shouldn't move, and by the time we get to 4 years, we'll all understand that and agree that. Or that which has to move, let's avoid people, with the uncertainty, prematurely pressing the button to move, when actually in 2 years' time they won't have to move. And then the third is, let's say nothing happens and we can't get those agreements. Then if we have to move, at least we have enough time to move it in a sensible way without a cliff edge, and to avoid a financial dislocation. And so we've made some progress here, not complete, but good progress. And we're relatively confident that it's in the interest of the EU as a whole, as well as London as a financial centre, to avoid this dislocation and to reach some sensible outcomes. But people, I've been talking about this to the US government informally over the last couple of days, and people say to me, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the outcome? And I say, well, you know, it's Wednesday, so I'm pessimistic today, but I'm going to be optimistic tomorrow.
I think that's probably the best explanation of what's going on in that area you're going to hear during these meetings in Washington. Thank you. Gail, there's an area that we haven't touched on, but it's an area near and dear to your heart, and mine also. And particularly, I think it's important, given some of the problems that we've seen, in the banking system. But now that we're in a period of deregulation, not only in the United States, but I see it coming in the UK. I see it coming in the Eurozone, in Germany, big time, talking to the banks, talking about the need to match what's going to happen here in the United States and the UK. And maybe you want to say something on the importance of culture and conduct in the financial system, but particularly the banking system.
Oh, thank you, Bill. Look, it is a hugely something I'm passionate about, deeply passionate about. And clearly it's been brought to the fore, it's been brought to the light. The weaknesses, the deficiencies with regard to culture has largely been exposed as a consequence of the financial crisis. And look, a couple of points I'll make. One is that as a consequence of the financial crisis, I thought really deeply about leadership and about the model of leadership, and sort of came to the conclusion that it's absolutely critical that firms and banks in particular not just have a clear picture of what they do and even how they do it, but critically that they understand why they do it. So what is their purpose? And I think some of that got lost from banks, the sense of we're here as intermediaries. We're here to fulfill a role within society. We're not here in a narrow sense of profit maximization for shareholders. And I think some of that got lost. So I think it's really critical that banks start, and bank leadership start with a clarity of understanding of what is our purpose, and to define that, communicate that, and line everything up behind that. Within the Westpac group, we did some work on this and came up with a very simple vision statement that said we want to be one of the world's most respected service companies, helping our people, our customers, our communities to prosper and grow. And so the idea of purpose is very easily encapsulated in that concept of helping. And now that's easy to say. The thing that you then have to do is line everything up behind it, and that's where the culture piece comes in, because, I mean, a lovely everyday definition of culture is what happens when no one's looking. And you want to make sure that when no one's looking, people are living this purpose. They're living this great service, putting customers at the center, genuinely making sure that the customer's best interest comes first, and facilitating this helping environment, consumers, fellow colleagues, and within the community. And so you have to hardwire that into your policies, your structures, your models. So all of the architecture elements of the organization, you need to hardwire these principles to your policies, what you do with products, what you do with pricing, what you do with your marketing, what you do with your sales elements, what you do with your whistleblower policies. All of that needs to be hardwired in your governance models. Then you need to softwire it too, which is the role modeling, the communication, the bringing it to life, the keeping it fresh, the showing the examples, you're showing that you're really serious. And that's from leadership all the way through. Leaders need to walk the talk on this and evidence in their everyday behavior that this matters. Now, this is a high bar for leaders these days in this environment of active social media and attention. And leaders can't hide. There's nowhere to hide. There's no sending out a PR team to deal with stuff. And if things go wrong, leaders need to front up quickly and early and say, we have made a mistake, I have made a mistake, this is what I'm going to do about it, and apologize for it. Those days of we acknowledge things have gone wrong, the sort of passive element, those days have to go. So quick, early, upfront dealing with things. The way we deal with regulators needs to change so that it's much more engaged, it's much more proactive. It's not legalistic. It's not that we only tell you things when we think we need to, letter of the law. Much more engaged and proactive. So culture change affects governance. It's got to be led by management and the board, affect every single architecture element of the organization all the way through, such that what really happens when no one's looking is the living of the values of the organization.
Thank you very much. And just one quick follow-up with you, Vanessa, and then I'm going to end with Mohamed on a favorite area of his, which I haven't even mentioned to him yet, but he will hear when I ask him the question. But Vanessa, could you follow up a little bit more? Because I think you were quite complete as you can be on NAFTA. But on the Pacific Alliance and the possibility of starting talks with Mercosur, I find a lot of interest in all those countries. Is this something that you think will need to wait till the new government in Mexico, or something that you think can start beforehand? Because I see this really being a very important, let's say, event in Latin America, perhaps the most important event we've seen economically, perhaps since World War II. And so maybe you might want to comment on the timing there.
Of course, I think it's something that is being done already, and it had some background even before the renegotiations of NAFTA started. But it didn't have the momentum that has now. The changes that have happened politically in Brazil and in Argentina, align the possibility of having this new relationship with free trade, with open borders, with deeper trade that the Pacific Alliance stands for. I was part of the first two meetings, for example, back when I was Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, of the two meetings between the Pacific Alliance and Argentina and Brazil, and they were completely different meetings than the ones they are holding now with the political changes that I'm referring to. So I think both countries are now more willingly to be open, are more willingly to get integrated with the rest of Latin America. So we're in a very good momentum to take advantage of that. As I said, there's some meetings have already started, some negotiations have already started in specific sectors, such as the automotive sector, the agriculture sector, and I think we're moving forward in the right direction and in a faster pace, and I think something can happen even before the change of government in Mexico in that regard. It again depends on the degree of depth and of willingness to advance. But the Pacific Alliance is very open. The rules are very clear. The rules are very much there to the eyes of everyone. So I think it would be a natural evolution of the Pacific Alliance to incorporate 2 or even 3 or 4 more Latin American countries, and obviously the integration with Asia, because there is also interest in regards to Canada, in regards to Asia Pacific, in regards to Canada, in regards to Australia, in regards to New Zealand, to be part also of the deeper integration process of the Pacific Alliance. So as we speak, that process is taking place, and I think it can be a smoother and a faster pace direction towards this integration of new countries to the Pacific Alliance.
Thank you. Mohamed, the question I was going to ask you, and you were the perfect one. When we got into this great recession, you were one of the first who said the name of the game are going to be the central banks. And now that we've entered this period, supposedly, of the great unwinding, how do you see that moving ahead?
Before I do that, because I've taken a whole page of notes, can I just thank the panelists? Because they provided clarity, and in one case, it really made me optimistic, and in the other case, it's depressed me completely. Gail, the clarity with which you said not just the what, but the how of corporate culture was incredible. And that encourages me that more people can take this much more seriously than it has in the past. John, the clarity of which you said the issue on Brexit, and as Bill said, it's probably the best exposition that we've heard, completely depresses me. Okay? Because
well, it doesn't make any sense.
It's such a UK-centric view, because it's as if you're the UK, I'm the EU. We embarked on this relationship. I believe there was going to be a holistic union, yes, political, social, economic. It turns out that you wanted a dating relationship, that you wanted basically the free trade area, but you didn't want any of the other stuff. Now we're forced to break up, and you're telling me, leave most of the community property with you, okay, because we're both worse off if you take it, so leave it with me. Wait, that ain't going to work. You're telling me, take your time, don't pursue your own thing, okay, hold on. And you've said it so clearly that I now realize that I should be even more worried about the next 2 years, right? But I love your comment on, and I wrote it down, we have to reshape ourselves into a tech firm that does a bit of banking rather than a bank that does a bit of technology. That is a really powerful statement, and it probably applies to so many different areas. Okay, central banks.
It's more like a first marriage than an overnight stand.
I know he's speaking from experience here.
Friends have told.
I have very little doubt that the Fed can normalize slowly without disrupting markets and without derailing the economy. To adapt a phrase that Ray Dalio used earlier when he talked about the beautiful deleveraging, I think this is the beautiful normalization. And we've already seen quite a bit of it. They've stopped buying assets. They've raised interest rates 4 times. They're going to raise a 5th time in December, is my expectations. And they've announced the reduction in their balance sheet is going to be like watching paint dry. Nothing exciting is going to happen there. So if the question you pose, Bill, is can the Fed exit without disrupting things, my answer is yes, and they're well on their way. If you ask me, can the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of Japan, and the People's Bank of China all simultaneously normalize without disrupting things, I would tell you, I don't know, but I suspect that that's going to be really, really tough. The only way these 4 things can happen is if not just we get synchronized growth, but we get growth takeoff. If there's fundamentally a policy revolution and central banks can hand off an excessive burden they've been carrying to other policymakers that have the much better instruments. Okay, that's the only case in which you can get simultaneous normalization. Otherwise, you either don't get it and then you fuel financial instability down the road, or you get it, an attempt at it, and you derail the economy. But if it's just the Fed can do it. But it's not just the Fed. There's 3 other central banks that have to do it as well.
And what about the Bank of England?
So I think the Bank of England is its own world, to be perfectly honest. Okay, they have the nightmare of any central bank, which is stagflation. Right? That's the one thing that makes them different, which is growth is been revised down, and inflation has been revised up. And that puts the Bank of England in a very peculiar situation. And John is better placed to talk about that.
I think we put John on the spot enough here. So, and I know I think we've got a little over half an hour, as I see it, maybe 40 minutes for questions. So, would you please raise your hand, give your name and who you represent, and microphones will be passed around to any of our members of the panel here, of this great panel we have. Yes. Can we get a microphone here?
I'm Dalal World. My question is about technology. And
can you just please say your name and who you represent?
Right. I'm the former governor of the Central Bank of Barbados.
Yeah, I know it, but I want you to say it.
So my question is about technology, and I wonder if we're asking the right question about technology. The thing that strikes me is that we have had this fantastic technological revolution in the last 20 years, maybe 30. But it isn't reflected in the growth of global productivity. And the question is, why not? And if we were, and so maybe, Mohamed, you can take a shot at it, or maybe John McFarlane, because maybe it has something to do with the potential of financial technology.
Okay, well, why don't we start with you, John, and go to Mohamed?
I think the problem is we're still in the early stages of this development. You know, it's far from mature. It's interesting. I was asked, you know, a question about the United States growth rate, and how does it, over long periods of time, decades, sustain that growth without immigration, largely from Latin America, and actually with great difficulty. But if you do take a decade's view, 30 years, 50 years, then artificial intelligence and robots are actually going to play an enormous role. I mean, I don't know when you were last in a car company looking at assembling a car. You know, there's a little guy making sure the machinery works, but it's all done by robots. Now, I'm not saying that that's the only thing here, but I do think the future role of technology, not just fintech, is enormous for the world, and I think as a consequence of that, productivity will emerge.
Of course, you then have the unemployment problem. Mohamed?
Mr. Governor, I don't have a good answer to the question, but some suggestions. One, I think there may be measurement issues. Two is, this is a different type of technology. Let me give you an example, because we're in a hotel, just to show you how different this is. These numbers I'm going to give you were as of the end of 2014. It had taken Hilton 100 years to provide 700,000 rooms to its clients around the world. 100 years, 700,000 rooms. And they had to either build or take over and manage hotels. Airbnb, 6 years, not 100 years, 1 million rooms. Okay. Now, how did they get there? Simply by using existing assets in a different way. That is a very different way to grow an economy. And it has massive implications that we don't capture well in traditional measurement. But I also agree with John that we are now at the stage where we're seeing the impact of technology go systemic. And you just look at the backlash happening against the big tech firms. It tells you this has gone systemic. So we came from a situation where it was firm-specific to sector-specific. Now it's going macro-specific. And we're going to see, and I actually share John's optimism that we're going to see this. But it's going to come with a lot of challenges, and Bill just referred to one, but there are many, many challenges. I don't think there's a single sector today that is immune from this very powerful combination of artificial intelligence, big data, and mobility. And now it changes the way you do things. The exciting thing is it increases both supply and demand. And that's what makes this so exciting, is it's simultaneously increasing both supply and demand. Uber being a perfect example of that. Airbnb being another example of that. But the other side of that is it disrupts the establishment in a really fundamental manner.
I think it puts a huge premium on education and skilling, don't you? I mean, a huge premium on that. We just have to double down as governments and as businesses on education and skilling. I don't think those days are gone where we can simply say the robot's taking your job, cheerio. We actually have to do a better job than that. We actually have to provide people with reskilling opportunities, retraining opportunities.
I think it's a very important subject. Back there.
Thank you. My name is Courtney Vaughn, and I'm a consultant in Washington here around the World Bank environment. My question is for the bankers, probably Barclays and others. What does the bank see, or how do you look at these financial technology companies and other companies that I would say support the financial system? How are the banks looking at valuation of these companies that today you're, I don't know, you're some little Microsoft, tomorrow you're issuing IPO? And I have a sense that valuation, because you're looking at these institutions, right, and you have to do your balance sheet, and you have, their liabilities to you if they're borrowing. I don't hear anybody talking about, for example, fundamentals in general acceptable accounting principles and how you're really valuing those companies. Are they also forcing a disruption on those principles, right? I feel that, again, some of these companies tend to overvaluate things, right? How does one monitor that? And with disruption, especially now that banks are also acquiring some of those companies, right? Are you inflating your balance sheet? And if there's a real disruption, then could it be more, could it have a bigger negative impact than we're probably anticipating?
I guess John and also Gail on that one.
I think you, actually.
No. The bankers.
No.
That's right.
I don't know, John. I defer to you.
Mohamed is now an advisor, so we take him out of that. So we start with you, John, and then Gail.
I think I'll give you an analogy here. I'm on the board of Westfield. You know, we build these big shopping centers, mainly around the U.S., okay? And if you look at retail sales in the U.S., last year, it grew around just under 5%. Now, the U.S. economy is not growing at that rate. And so, but when you unbundle that, you find that stores have gone up by 1%, and online sales of the other 4%. If you then unbundle that 4%, it's made up of largely of 4 companies: Amazon, eBay, Apple, and Samsung. Which last year was negative because you had the problem with those phones. It's positive this year. If you then say, well, what was the growth of Amazon and eBay last year? It was 23%. And so there are a number of conclusions that you draw from this. Firstly, these are valued on growth. They're not valued on return. The value of a company is the capital you put in plus the present value of the excess returns you can create from that capital. So it's an area under a curve, which means the growth rate matters, the level of return matters, the time over which you generate excess returns matters, you lower the fade, and the risk of those excess returns matters. The more risky they are, then the more deflation of the curve, then the lower the risk they are, the higher. And so in essence, that's the equation. But if you look at that equation for these potentially very fast growing companies, it's all about potential growth. It's not about the return and other elements. And so you're absolutely correct. There's misvaluation in the sense of the startups, because you might have 100 startups, but there's only a certain percentage that are actually going to succeed. The problem is, in advance, you don't know which ones. I mean, I used to have a board at ANZ. I was the CEO of a bank. And every time a company went bust, somebody on that board said, I can't believe you dealt with that company. Everybody knew they were going to go bust. And so I said to them, well, okay, here's the top 100 exposures. Which ones of those are going to go bust? And then the next 100, then the next 100, and they said, we give in, we can't do it. Right. And it's the same here. You can't actually tell which of these are going to succeed, but you know, investors will buy differentially into them. But over time, return will matter. But at this point in the cycle, and so the question is, what's our role in this? Our role is to turn ourselves to the extent possible into those, because of the customer is really deciding where they deal with us. But the second is that we should create them. I mean, Barclays creates hundreds of startups a year through our accelerators, and not just fintech, but other startups. And I mean, I'll tell you privately, the reason we do that is it makes Barclays look cool. But, you know, because you walk into these places and you say, my God, Barclays is cool. And so it's actually beneficial for the company that we actually are doing this. But the real reason is that we become their first customer. And therefore, we can then either use the blockchain that they create for our business system, or the channel they create, or the product that we create. And therefore, we don't own them, but we get the benefit of them in our business system.
Gail?
I think John's answered the question really well. The other reason why, of course, you have these startups is because you learn a lot. It's an incredible way to learn, get up the value chain really early, because if you really want to innovate, doing it in your mainstream business is really hard, but doing it on the side through startups, through sort of quarantine businesses with dedicated people is the way to get cut through. But to answer your question, I mean, I think it's a little bit different from the dot-com era of the early 2000s. I completely agree with John, your valuation on growth, but some of these big platform companies are now spinning off massive cash. So they're in a different mode, and they are the winner-take-all type players. So I think it's a little different. You've got the startups that's being valued on growth, and then you've got these massive big players that are spinning off lots and lots of cash. And they're buying all these little startups because they don't want to brook any competition. So we've got a monopoly player here with these big platforms.
I mean, take a look at Alibaba.
Yeah,
It was a startup not that long ago, and look where Alibaba is today. I mean, it's really challenging Apple in the sense of size and where it's going, depending, of course, on what Xi Jinping decides it'll do, but that's another story. Vanessa?
Just a brief comment on fintech industry. I think this is quite a disruptive industry in terms of the way we need to view it, the way we need to regulate it, the way we need to approach it. Because as the governor was saying, if this is a reflection of the growth of global productivity. I think this is the other way around exactly. Technologies are there, they are applied to financial sector, and then they can result in the growth of global productivity if given the proper conduction, no? So I think it's quite a topic what we have here in terms of a huge challenge to regulators, because you have all these fintechs that do sort of old traditional financial services with innovation and with new platforms, but you also have another series of fintech industries that do it with totally new elements, such as virtual currencies, no? And virtual currencies can touch or cannot touch the traditional financial system. So that puts a huge challenge to the regulation in terms of national regulation, but also these transactions being by principle transnational. Obviously, there needs to be a further agreement globally in terms of what to regulate, what to not regulate, so you can enhance innovation, which is natural to these industries, so you can enhance inclusiveness, which is also the good part of this industry, but you can also be aware of consumer protection and the financial integrity of the whole system to be preserved.
And then cyber risk. I mean, one of the big issues here is the opening up of your systems. You can only open it up to people who are cyber resilient. So the EU has decided that all payment systems are going to be open to new entrants to increase competition. That means customers can give them their access details to their account with a bank, okay? And our argument is we should open up the system, but you can only open it up to people that have been validated, that their technology is cyber resilient.
That's a huge issue.
Well, it's certainly one of the biggest challenges I think the financial world faces in the next couple of years. Other questions? Yes.
Gary Kleiman, Kleiman International Consultants. Thank you, panelists. Your remarks are received very warmly, even if the room is freezing cold. But I wanted to pick up on Mohamed's point about low volatility and ask a generic question about the whole field in relationship to emerging market investing. The models, the economic model is broken and in need of a replacement. You look at something like valuations in terms of historical PE ratios, again, it makes no sense, the current context. You look at the proliferation of indices, both in terms of stocks and bonds, long overdue for consolidation, often working at cross purposes and now magnified by the huge inflows of ETFs by average retail investors into the sector. What's called low volatility is perhaps a lot of stasis in decision making, particularly as it relates to traditional emerging market investing, and I wonder what your opinion would be on the relationship there.
Mohamed, that's put to you directly.
Gary, it's wonderful to see you. Where I would take issue with the way you framed the question is when you said it makes no sense. Actually, it makes a lot of sense. It may make a lot of sense for the wrong reasons, but it makes a lot of sense. If you offer financial markets the possibility of chopping off, taking away volatility risk, you will get the outcomes that you're getting today. Okay? The markets have been conditioned to believe that because central banks are using the asset channel to promote economic growth, and part of that is to repress volatility, the markets have now believe that volatility should no longer be taken into consideration. Okay, so you get two behaviors that impact emerging markets. The first one, the technical term is you sell volatility. Okay, you're willing to underpin all sorts of potential volatility because you don't have to worry about it. Okay, so the more volatile the area, the more it benefits from new inflows of investors, and emerging markets being that. Okay, so and I always say, forget about the VIX. Yes, everybody says it's at record low. Look at the fact that every single correction today is bought immediately. because the investor base has been conditioned to believe that since central banks cover our back, every dip, no matter whether it's because of North Korea or is a buying opportunity. So you have them fewer in numbers and less extreme. And this year so far, with all that's been going on, you've had the lowest daily maximum fall, lowest, so the tiniest fall in the S&P in the history of the whole S&P, to tell you how powerful that condition is. So the first thing you do is you sell volatility, and buying emerging market assets is a way of selling volatility. The second thing you do is you give up liquidity, because liquidity is no longer important. Why? Because you're not going to be forced into doing something silly. The industry responds by offering you lots of ETFs. So the second element that you said. So now we see a proliferation of ETFs in illiquid asset classes. You and I know that that is bad news over the long term, but who cares if the world has no volatility? So where I disagree with you is this all makes sense. It's the result of a policy choice that has been taken by central banks, not because they want to, because they felt they had to on that. Okay. Further down the road, it's a different issue. I don't think you can repress volatility forever. I think there's going to be really big surprises when people discover that they've given up liquidity too cheaply. But for now, it makes sense, and it has made people a lot of money.
And I think the real question here is, when does that moment come, Mohamed? Because the reach and search for yield is something I've never seen. Because as you say, the central banks, which is why I asked you that last question, have covered everyone's back for the last, 8, 9 years? And the question is, what happens with the great unwinding over time? And that's going to be a real challenge, that's for sure. I don't know, Gail, do you want to comment or John on that?
No. Very clear.
Okay. Other questions? We've got plenty of them over here. No, it's always good to have a mic so the rest can hear.
There have been references to data security, cyber security, but I wonder if the panels from different perspectives can elaborate on that, both in terms of protection of your own financial system, your financial data, your own investments, but also protection of customer information, but also access to information in terms of potential restrictions on credit information. There's a range of things, but clearly hacking and cybersecurity are themes of the century, perhaps, but how your institutions are responding, how you see it from the various perspectives that your chairs are sitting in. Thank you.
Why don't we start with you, John, and go right through?
I think this is a new problem for everybody. We've been unprepared for this, and what's happened is that the hackers, which are often state enterprises, are ahead of the game. Look at how many Microsoft updates you get these days, but they're catch-ups because somebody's actually broken into it. They found out how they'd broken into it, and so they're ahead of the game. I think what you have to do is two things. One is if you can't protect, well, firstly, you can't protect everything, and therefore you have to decide what you need to protect and make sure that's protected. I think within that, if you can't protect it, you shouldn't be in it at all because it will actually be vulnerable. Right. And thirdly, you've got to assume that they're already in. They just haven't come out because they don't know what they've got. And that's a much better way of thinking about this, is that the people who are in there, and it's often internal people inside your organization that have actually created the way in. And so this has got to be every firm's number one priority now. If you're not cyber ready, you don't deserve to exist. And it's certainly our number one priority.
Mohamed?
I have nothing to add on that.
Well, I know that Gail has comments on this.
I would agree with everything John said and add to that the critical need for cooperation in this space, cooperation between firms and cooperation with government. This is not a competitive thing. This needs absolutely maximum cooperation. I tell you what, for me, this is the biggest systemic risk. that we face. And it's not just whether someone's data is compromised and they might lose money out of their account. For me, this whole cybersecurity thing goes to, what happens at a national level, at a security level. I mean, we've just had, or we're having the whole debate about the Russians' penetration of the US election data. Well, if you're talking about terrorism, I mean, a next window or a next play field could be with regard to data. Bringing planes down out of the sky and a whole range of things that you can think about if you can actually penetrate the data. So I really worry a lot about data and data protection, and I think it needs a huge amount of investment, resources, manpower, intellectual capability being brought to bear on this.
I think you're correct about it being the biggest danger. I mean, we used to think it was Russian, Chinese. Now we find out that the North Koreans are pretty good at it. They managed to steal the plans right out of the South Korean Defense Ministry, and it took them time to find out about it. And then we had the hack of the Fed. I mean, this thing, I think, is so much larger. And I think the governments, and I'll say our own right there in the United States, are behind on this. I don't know about Europe, but I think that we're behind on it. And I think there's not sufficient cooperation between, as you say, Gail, the public and private sector here. Because so much of this is driven by states themselves, by the sovereign. And I think it is the biggest single danger because it's not just economic now, as we've learned from the elections. It's also political.
Strategic. Yeah.
And so it's all over the place. I think it's a very good question. It's something we were on the fringes of but hadn't gotten to. Other questions? Yes.
Christian Keller from Barclays. I would like to bring the question back to central banks. There's been mentioned several times now that the reason why we have low volatility, high asset valuations, is because central banks are still quite accommodative, and they are withdrawing accommodation step by step. We have some normalization. I'm not so afraid whether they can do it simultaneously because it seems there is some sequence. The Fed moves first, and then we'll have the ECB, and then at some point the BOJ. But the second question is, they're all trying to reach inflation targets of 2%. The Bank of England is managing it, but only because of pass-through. None of the core central banks is managing to achieve the 2% target. And so now we are accusing them of being potentially too accommodative and thereby creating future financial instability. But at the same time, they can just point to their target. It's 2%, and they're not there. And my question is, are we at a point where maybe we really have to rethink inflation targeting and the mandates that we've given to these central banks? And it looks increasingly so that, that was also said earlier, that we no longer understand our economies that well, in a way that, Phillips curves are flat. Maybe they're so flat that they don't matter anymore. And so if we leave central banks with that mandate, may we inevitably, in a way, get to a situation where this runs for a few more years, but then, we will have a large correction. And you may say, who cares, they just do it like the Bank of England, like the Bank of Japan. We have a 2% target and they never reach it. But the fact is that markets always look at central banks and authority. Now, they seem to be losing credibility because they're telling us about models that no longer work. They're not reaching 2%. And my question, in a way, to the panel is, do we need a rethink about the mandates for central banks? And I guess the next panel is going to look at this, but I'd be interested to hear, in particular, Mohamed on that. Thank you.
Mohamed, this is one first to you, and I'll ask our other friends if they'd like to comment.
Wait for Axel.
So actually, it's a question to Martin Wolf, yes. who wrote.
We'll let him do that on the next panel,
and
Martin.
Axel, who's just walked in.
Yeah, and Axel, who just walked in.
We're passing questions to you, Axel, just as you walk in.
Yeah, we were just waiting for you, Axel, for you and Martin to get here.
It's a central bank question.
I think the key phrase in what all you said, okay, is what if you have a target you can never reach? Right? And that is a really important issue. Remember, there was nothing magical about the 2%. There was absolutely nothing magical. It was a convergence. It was supported by historical data. And today, there is a legitimate debate that's going to accelerate as to whether the structural changes that are ongoing especially things that we talked about earlier in the panel, mean that the right target may be different from 2%. And if you pursue 2% without taking into account all these structural changes, you may have unintended consequences, or you may never get there and give up on something that you should have. I think that is a fundamental issue, and I go back to the three things we don't understand well I said in the beginning: productivity, inflation dynamic, and wage determination. And there is a real risk, because we don't understand these things well, that we may end up with a policy mistake.
I'll just say one thing. It depends which economy you're in. If you've got a very fast car, it's going to use oil up faster in order to create the speed. So in those very fast-growing economies, they generally have more inflation. And so in a sense, you have to tailor it to the economy you're in.
Okay, I think that I'm getting word that the next panel's here, and although we've covered the waterfront, I did want to leave something for the next panel, and particularly for my friend, the next moderator here. We have to give him a challenge on the going forward. So would you give our panel a great hand? I think they've done a great job. Thank you. Igualmente.
For once the committee is running ahead of schedule, but that doesn't indicate that we're going to have a long break. But I'm glad that everybody had a chance to stand briefly, circulate a little bit, but I think now the time is coming when we have to return to our program, which is great. One thing leads to the other. This is going to be, I know from the participants, a splendid performance in terms of content and style. And we have, Martin, you're across the room from me, Martin, but nevertheless, I will introduce you very briefly with a few words. You know his background. The very important thing is that he has been a financial economist, journalist for years, been awarded many things, many decorations and so forth, and written many books. And I find that the most fascinating of them all, which is, I think it's his most recent, was the shifts and the shocks, what we've learned and have still to learn from the financial crisis. And I'm very anxious to hear how he and his colleagues here on the program will be able to update us on that subject. Martin, the floor is yours.
So, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here in this very beautiful room and this very distinguished audience. I have been told very firmly that my subject is financial stability and reform. So that means that I can completely ignore the questions that were asked earlier about central banks. I don't know where that's coming from. If this is some interaction, sorry about this. So I can ignore what was being asked about central banks, except that I actually think it's part of the story, so we should discuss it at least to some extent. Now, before I introduce the topic, though that seems sort of unnecessary, may I introduce the panel? I'm sure it's a remarkable panel, so we should have a wonderful discussion. So we start on the right with François Villeroy de Gallo, Governor of the Banque de France, and I apologize for the appalling pronunciation. Next in, you are a very kind man. If only everybody in France was so kind to the British at the moment. Not that we deserve it. I'll be absolutely clear about that. I'm entirely on your side. Now, next to him is Stefan Ingves, Governor at the Sveriges Riksbank, sponsor of the sometimes called Nobel Prize in Economics, and a very distinguished monetary economist indeed. Oh, is mine not working? Okay. Next to him is Axel Weber, Group Chairman of UBS, of course a very distinguished economist and previously President of the Bundesbank. And to my right is Barbara Novik, Vice Chairman of BlackRock, and Weber obviously really understands. Is this working at all? No? Okay, in that case, I'll just talk. Never mind this. Technology is such a mistake. You all believe in it much too much. So, next to me is Barbara Novik, Vice Chairman of BlackRock in the markets, and therefore she understands everything. The question we've been asked is financial stability and reform, and obviously the core of the question is 10 years from the global financial crisis. There's been a tremendous effort by the international community to consider the stability of the financial system, its structure in every possible way, and we of course want to believe that they fix the problem, or at least people here might not, but the public at large certainly does. It will be no very great surprise that I start from the assumption that they have failed. That's simply because we have had liberalized financial markets for quite a long time, and whenever they have been liberalized, and they remain liberalized despite regulation, they have an extraordinary ability to generate crises where people had not foreseen them. And so the question is really, is this time different? One factor here is simply, have they responded in a coherent, intelligent, and effective way to the risks? And the other one, which I think we must come to, is how far regulation will prove yet again to be pro-cyclical. That is to say, as the economy now recovers, as the mood improves, there are some governments, one of them not many yards from here, which thinks it actually will be a very good time to liberalize. And that's absolutely classic. We always liberalize pro-cyclically, and then we find this is a serious mistake, and then in the middle of the crisis we start regulating like crazy. And so one is beginning to see signs of this pro-cyclicality. And then the other set of issues, which I do think was actually touched on already, is the interaction between, and it was a theme of my book in fact, the interaction between monetary policy making and financial policy making. That is to say, how easy is it, indeed is it even possible, to run a monetary policy aimed at a certain level of output, employment, and inflation, macroeconomic variables in the economy, while protecting the financial sector and the activities of the financial sector, the risk rate in the financial sector, from the possible dangerous consequences of the monetary policy, which is of course designed to encourage them to take risks. That's what it's supposed to do. That's how it works. So there is a potential tension between the two. So that's all I have to say in the form of introduction, and I I had a general question, which, if I can get this to Bretton, which all the participants now have a few minutes to respond to, not more than 5. And the question was, almost 10 years after the global financial crisis, how far do you think financial sector reforms have remedied the defects revealed so starkly in the crisis? What reforms, if any, are still needed, or are things now perfect? And what might happen if instead reforms were now to be reversed? And if I may, I will start with you, Governor. Thank you, Martin. Do you hear me? No. You will.
Just speak.
No, it just takes a minute for is it better now? I keep on, but
Take this as an insurance.
I will have, if necessary, this second solution. So just to tell you what pleasure it is for me to be with the Bretton Woods Committee. To be frank, I'm just off my plane from Europe, and it will be a rather short pleasure. Does it work better? Yes. So I was just saying that I'm off my plane. And that my pleasure to be here will be unfortunately rather short because I will have to leave for a G7 meeting a bit before the end of this panel. But answering Martin's question, without any doubt, the financial system is today safer than it was 10 years ago. And the impressive achievement of the international corporations under the umbrella of the G20 and of the Financial Stability Board dates back, if you look to the London agenda and the Pittsburgh agenda in 2009, we collectively realized an impressive part of it. And we realized the strengthening of financial regulation without weighing on economic growth. I stress it because it's sometimes contested. I think cannot say seriously that there had been an adverse effect of financial regulation on growth, and we are experiencing worldwide and in Europe a recovery which is sound and robust. Having said that, and to go very quickly, there is no room for complacency. And we should be extremely clear about that. There can be some temptations, and you mentioned some of them. We should use this economic recovery in order to achieve 3 goals very quickly. First, and this is the most obvious one, we should preserve what we already achieved. Second, we should rebalance economic policies. And third, we should complete financial regulation. To go very quickly, on the first one, we should not go backwards. And this is true on both sides of the Atlantic, including this one. There can be some debate about domestic regulation. This one can be adjusted, adapted. But the international rules we decided upon, we must keep them. They are not growth adverse, as I said, and they are very necessary in order to diminish the risk of the next financial crisis. Second, about economic policies, and you alluded to monetary policies. We central bankers have kept saying for long that monetary policy should not be the only game in town. Now, clearly, it's time to act. It's a window of opportunity. What does it mean? Strengthening national reforms. And here, there are good news in the country I know best, but it's not the only one. Reforms are accelerating in France with a significant diminution of the fiscal deficit, a liberalization of labor market laws, and this week, a new effort for vocational training and education. In the Eurozone, we have another work to conclude, which is the strengthening of the economic union. National reforms and strengthening of the economic union. This is what we need in order to rebalance economic policies and not to overburden monetary policy. Third, I mentioned the completion of the financial regulation. One word about banks and
one word about non-banks. About banks, this has been the work of the Basel Committee under Stefan's chairmanship. Let me remind you that we have achieved already a very significant work on Basel III in 2011, let's say approximately 80% of it. I strongly wish we can finalize Basel III soon, and I really welcome the collective effort of the Basel Committee. We have made significant progress, but we are not yet there. We need a fair and consistent agreement. To say it very briefly, a fair agreement meaning obviously that it must apply to all jurisdictions in all its components, including a clear view on the trading book. And this agreement must be consistent in order to preserve the risk sensitivity. So it must remain mainly based on seriously checked internal models. And I stress more seriously checked. We are ready to go quite far in this direction. But if we don't rely mainly on internal models, it would mean that we would go from Basel III to a Basel IV, mainly based on the standard approach. This is not what we said. This is not what we want collectively. So an output floor must be calibrated in order to remain a backstop. This is for the banking side, and we will work very hard to achieve that. On the non-bank side, probably the agenda is a bit heavier. To put it in a nutshell, and I will conclude with that, we have made many progresses on the solvency of banks, and we have to complete them. We have to do probably more progress now on the liquidity of non-banks, including the so-called shadow banking, and I stop here for the 5 minutes.
But I have the microphone. Pass the microphone. I hope you'll be around when Barbara refers, discussing, because I would like to discuss further this question of the liquidity of non-banks, since I have a sort of guess that it might have something to do with her, or more broadly, the sort of firm she's part of. Let me move to Stefan.
So thank you for that, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to say a few words about where we are when it comes to regulatory reform. And François has, of course, already touched on many of these things. So let me give a kind of a plumber's view of where we are when it comes to dealing with the plumbing. And it's up to the next generation to argue whether we got the plumbing right or wrong. So I'm dealing with the technical details. So what is it that we have achieved? What is left to do? First of all, what became clear during the financial crisis was that we ended up with a system, and I'm basically talking now from the perspective of banks, with a system that was too levered. And in addition to that, to the extent there was capital around, it wasn't really of high quality. And that needed to be fixed. The second part of it was that we found out the hard way that there was a high degree of systemic risk, too much interconnectedness among the banks, and that became a problem with very large intertwined institutions. And then there were insufficient liquidity buffers because basically banks and others ran out of money, and the idea was to make sure that it takes longer in the future before that happens.
I think you're going to have to hold the mic closer to your mouth.
Before that.
I know it's a bit awkward, but it doesn't seem to work otherwise.
Okay.
I think you're swallowing it.
So what we have done first on capital is that the quality and the level of capital in the system went up. If I use the term common equity tier 1, it went up from 2% under Basel II to in the range of 7 to 13%, depending on type of banks and type of buffers. And that means that for some globally systemically important banks, it went up by a factor of 6. And that's That's quite a lot. You can argue about this number, whether it's high enough or not, but it certainly is an improvement compared to what we had in the past. In addition to that, a leverage ratio has been introduced as a backstop so that you cannot expand your balance sheet indefinitely. And on top of that, we have an overlay of requirements for very large, globally active financial institutions. And then we have the countercyclical capital buffer on top of that. And then when it comes to liquidity, we've done two things. One, put in place what is called the liquidity coverage ratio. Setting the technical parts of it aside, it basically says that you should have enough money around to last you 30 days when it comes to outflows. And then we have the net stable funding ratio, basically saying that there should be a cap on the maturity mismatch, which is allowed. I mean, banking is about maturity transformation, so clearly that needs to be there because that's what banking is all about, but there has to be a limit on how much you do that. Now, does this mean that we have completed the job? Well, not quite. There's one remaining issue that we're dealing with presently, and that is the fact that the risk-weighted framework lost a lot of credibility during the financial crisis. And then that needs to be corrected, and we have spent quite a lot of work trying to do that. First part of that has been to revise the old standardized approach for calculating risk weights, making it more risk sensitive, and actually just basically modernizing the standardized approach because it was just getting too old. The second part of it has been to take a close look at banks' internal models and put in some constraints on internal models, particularly when it comes to trying to model risks that cannot be modeled robustly. And that, of course, reduces the degrees of freedom. And finally, and this is what we are struggling with presently, is to find a reasonable relationship between the standardized approach and banks' internal models. This nowadays goes under the heading of an output floor. And what remains to be done here is to come to a conclusion on settling on a number. And then once that is done, if it will get done, then many other sort of technical bits and pieces will follow from that. So that's where we are. I agree with Francois that really a lot of stuff has been done, but we have this final element that we need to finalize. And once we have done that, then we have basically spent 10 years dealing with the plumbing after the global financial crisis. So I truly hope that it will be possible in the fairly near future in one way or the other to settle this at the global level.
Just to clarify, can you indicate from your position how long you think that completion process might take, if all goes well, leaving aside significant disruptions that might occur, which one can easily imagine, but assuming that it proceeds as it is now, when do you think this will all be done?
Well, I've been the chairman of the Basel Committee now for 6 years, and I have thought that we were done many times in the past when it comes to many technical issues. So it would just to overpromise to say that it's going to happen within a certain time frame. Let me say, though, that all parties involved have many times declared that they would like to finish this. So there is consensus on that one. But so far, there has not been a consensus on when to do it.
It would, however, be cynical to say that you will still be doing it on the dawn of the next financial crisis.
Well, yeah, that wouldn't be a good thing, and this is, of course, one of the issues, and that's given that it takes a long time to do these things. After a while, if you have been doing these things with the same people around the same table, the intensity sort of tends to go down because people forget how bad it was the last time. So there is a window of opportunity while people still remember, and I think we should use that.
Urgency declines, it's radioactively.
Yes.
Yes, that's clear. Axel, you've been actually on both sides of this as a central banker, economist, and now a banker. How do you see this? And I'd be particularly interested in where, and I hope very much you do, you disagree on something with what you have heard.
Not a lot, and my mic has been working before. It doesn't seem to do anymore, so I'm using this as well. Actually, I think Stefan and Francois are absolutely right. After the last financial crisis, there's a lot of things we saw that weren't really working well before the crisis and actually were part of what caused the crisis. So they needed to be fixed. I don't think you'll find a single banker in this room that will tell you the re-regulation did not have some good reasons and we fixed a lot of issues that needed to be fixed. I think that is beyond doubt on all sides of the table when you talk about regulation. And I think when you just look at the group of banks that I represent here, which are now called GSIBs, global systemically important banks, as Stefan said, there's been a number of layers of capital been added. We have made much more progress on high liquid asset buffers. We have basically institution-specific recovery and resolution plans. We've changed our legal and organizational structure. We reduced financial and operational interconnectiveness. We in the bank put an operating unit, what used to be corporate center, out into an independently run governance body under a holding structure. So a lot has been done to enhance the operability and to reduce interconnectedness. We've changed corporate governance, we've changed incentives, and I'm going to come back to the incentive issues. And basically, we've reformed derivative markets and financial infrastructure markets. 90% of the trades that now happen are centrally cleared or trade reporting occurs. So a lot of issues have been fixed, and I think the regulators can really be proud that they put a lot of these issues on the agenda and work with the industry to fix these issues. No doubt a lot of that needed to be done. But when it comes to the plumbing, and again, we've heard Francois and Stefan, if you ever build a house, there is a point where the builders get very tired and they start running away from the building site because there is regulatory fatigue setting in. And what we've heard here around the table are the guys that do the plumbing in the basement. It's below the radar screen, and a lot of the pipes have been rewired. If I own a house, my problem is not how great the pipes in the basement are. My problem is what actually gets to the water tap and what can I actually use in the first and in the second floor. And that's where I think a new set of people come into the game, which are not the regulators and the standard setters, but it's actually policymakers. And I think where we are now is, as the Basel Committee, one question was what needs to be done. What needs to be done is some of the finalization of the Basel standards, but then these guys are handing over to the policymakers and to parliaments who now need to put all of the agreed regulation in rule books and into a legal framework. The experience of that handover isn't been that great. Actually, when you look back at Basel II and when the Basel Committee did an evaluation of compliance, they found that two major constituencies around the globe, Europe and the US, has been materially non-compliant with Basel II. Some smaller countries, Germany is one of them, Switzerland is one of them, Japan is one of them, have actually been fully compliant because a lot of the rules of Basel II were put in legislation nationally. And in Europe, it now needs a European directive or European regulation. We're already seeing that handover is happening. There are a number of areas where basically policymakers are looking at the rules written, and it's not for the next generation of rule makers to judge whether the rules are good. Policymakers take the liberty to look at the rules and to implement what they think is good and to not implement other stuff that they think is not good. So look at the recent Treasury paper. It outlines that when you look at the fundamental review of the trading book, thank you very much, Basel. We agree that this is a great set of legislation and rules that you've written, but actually when it comes to implementing that in the US, let's have another look at the impact of this. Let's look how this fits into a capital market-based system, and actually we'll need to do an impact assessment. It'll take a bit of, thank you very much for the rules, and we'll start talking about whether we implement that. The European side looks at that and says, hang on, everything on full stop. The US is not doing this. We're not going to do it. So in the end, you're going to end up probably with the same number of countries that think these new rules are good rules, and they will implement it through Pillar 2 and through adjustments of capital requirements. But we will not get a level playing field where these new rules will be implemented in the same way. And the reason for that is because the regulators that are passing this over are now in the game of having compromises. A compromise between some that propose a 70% floor and others that propose a 75% floor could be 72.5. It just pastes over the problem that they don't agree what the floor should be. And if you pass it on with some compromise like that, it's not going to get implemented in those constituencies where there is doubt that the compromise is actually a good compromise. So I think we're facing a Passover problem here. And however good the rule-making and the rule-writing is, what really matters for us as users of these rules is not the rules designed in Basel. It's the rules implemented in the national jurisdictions and in the rule books of countries through EU directives or through American laws that are passed by Congress and that are proposed by the administration. And that's where I think there is still some disconnect. We're not going to get the same outcome and the same level playing field as the rule makers are putting in front of us, because that, if everywhere adopted, would be a good set of rules that is applied. For we, as a GSIB, a global bank, we need global rules, and we need rules that we can work with in every constituency where we work. For us at UBS, I mean, we start trading and doing financial business in the morning, starting from Australian and New Zealand markets through Tokyo, Hong Kong, Singapore, through the European markets, through the US, New York, and actually we close in the evening and pass on the book again when the market closes in San Francisco. We need a set of rules that is a level playing field across these constituencies. I don't think we're in a very good starting point to get that. There's a lot of stuff that is still controversial and will not get implemented despite the fact that the design phase has been finished. And I think that is a problem, and we should really address that. And by the way, I don't think there will be a rollback of rules, because you asked about that. I think it would be a pity if we were to roll back on these rules. However, that doesn't mean that we should look at the rules and really see whether all of the rules are designed in a way that really fosters stability without having a major price for the ability of financial institutions to finance growth. Where we get that balance right, where the rules are such that there is a clear enhancement of stability without a major impact, negative impact on the ability of financial institutions to be part of the credit origination process, I think this is all fine. Where the pendulum may have swung too far in another direction, I think it is worthwhile to look at that. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that everything that's on the table needs to be blindly implemented. I think there is some place for impact assessment and for looking at what this means. The financial industry has been calling for a financial assessment of the impact of the new regulation. However, the tight working schedule didn't really permit for this to be broad-based. There have been some impact studies, but I think they're really preliminary. So in my view, I think we should give this a bit more time and thorough work and getting rules that are implemented in the same way everywhere, rather than designing new non-level playing field issues, because I can tell you, like with the flood, the water will come in where the bars are the lowest. And not having a level playing field is a major problem and actually could be a reason for the next financial crisis.
If you don't mind, if you don't mind, Barbara, because the governor is leaving very soon and Axel has raised such big questions about implementation of all these fine regulations, I'd like you, Francois and Stefan, to respond now, because we've got this issue on the table and it's a big one. So are these rules going to be implemented in a systematic way, or are we going to have a race to the bottom, or the water, using the different metaphor, flooding in the bits of the basement which aren't properly waterproofed?
Well, it's a bit too early to tell, but I can tell you that during the Basel II days, Basel II was agreed but never checked. But when it comes to Basel III, we have actually started a process to check compliance all over the world, and that has been actually remarkably accepted by everybody. And all those reports are maybe not the most exciting novels in the world to read, but all this stuff is actually publicly available. And as far as I know, and this we keep track of this in Basel, looking at those assessments, we have summed up more than 1,000 changes to domestic regulatory frameworks as a consequence of this work that we have done. That's not at all saying that these things are perfect, in no way at all, but we have made substantial progress when it comes to actually following what countries are doing in a way completely different to the way it was done in the past. And today, remarkably, most jurisdictions in the world accept a completely different level of transparency than in the past. So we're not there 100% from Axel's perspective, but there certainly has been movement.
Please,
Jonas. Two quick remarks. First, I completely agree on what Stefan just said. We should not forget that Basel III already exists. We speak about the finalization of Basel III, but I told earlier that 80% of the job has been done as early as 2011 and implemented seriously. Not perfectly, but really seriously. Having said that, and this is why I mentioned the necessity of a fair agreement on the finalization, there are issues which are important in the last package we are negotiating, including the trading book. And this issue is very sensitive for a level playing field. It's why I stressed it.
I'm not quite clear whether there's a happy consensus between you three on whether it's all solved, but I'm going to pass this for the moment and now turn to Barbara. I say whatever you feel about financial stability and regulation, but I would be interested, above all, in your view of where the asset managers fit in and whether you pose any systemic risks at all and whether they should just go away and leave you alone.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and to participate in this panel. I'd like to answer the first question, and we'll come to your second question. So the first question was, is the system safer? And I will say, as a large investor in the markets, we're pleased to say we think the system is safer. It's not in our clients' interest to have unsafe systems, and we feel their pain when things don't go well. So I would compliment many of the policymakers and regulators, whether it is the Basel agreements or it is a work of the FSB. If you look today, everything from banks to OTC derivatives, cash investing, and even funds, there have been improvements, enhancements in all of those categories. Now, that said, you look around, we've had some major market events, and I'll just use one example, Brexit. Big market moves. You don't see any banks failing. In fact, you don't see firms failing at all. So, that is good evidence, and I could give a whole list of major market events in the last several years. That's a good sign. When you then look around and say, well, let's take stock of where we are, and I think Axel said it well, did we do too much? That doesn't mean that you need to repeal or you need to deregulate, and I would even take exception with your comment about pro-cyclical changes to regulation, because I think as you look, the FSB has undertaken to look at the impacts of regulation comprehensively. The European Union undertook a call for evidence, similar. No one called those pro-cyclical or deregulation or some sort of bad thing. They're looking at it as a good thing. When I look at what the Treasury is doing, they've published now 2 reports, one on banking, one on capital markets. They do make fascinating reads. What is really interesting is it's absolutely not about deregulating. I'll give 2 small examples in the 250 pages they released last week. They had an idea that in the United States, we have 50 states, Each has different regulators for brokers and things like that. And they suggested we have a national database for bad actors. I think that's a great idea. Why shouldn't we be able to figure out who not to hire very quickly? So there's just a concrete example where they're asking for more regulation in a sense. Likewise, CCPs, which I've been quite outspoken about in the last several years. Central clearing, we are hugely in favor of. We think it's a great idea. We think it makes a lot of sense for safety and stability. But please protect the end investors. Whether it's their collateral or it's their exposures, we need to make them more resilient. The Treasury report talks about that. So I don't think at all, if you haven't read it, you should. It's a capital markets primer, but it's certainly not a one-sided view. Now, in terms of asset managers and the reference to non-banks and, of course, liquidity of non-banks, we've talked a lot over the last several years about what is a source of systemic risk. And clearly, you need to have certain characteristics. You have to have a balance sheet. Most likely, you need to be using either leverage or be exposed to short-term funding. So if you look at the people who have had problems over many, many years, not just the recent crisis, but look back to Drexel, look at long-term capital, look at any of these firms, banks, funds, anything that has had trouble, they all have a lot of leverage. And they all have somehow exposure to short-term funding. Commercial paper they can't roll over, repo lines that get pulled, something in the short markets. Now look at a typical asset manager. We actually don't have much of a balance sheet, and it's not just BlackRock, it's the industry. We are agents on behalf of other people. We're not the counterparty to the trades. We're not the counterparty to the derivatives. We're not exposed to short-term funding. And by the way, we don't have any insured deposits. So the characteristics that would lead you to a systemically risky institution don't exist. Hence the FSOC pivot and the FSB's pivot to products and activities. So I used two examples. Imagine if the FSB had looked at OTC derivatives and said, you know, we really got to fix this. So we're going to take the largest two dealers in the world and we're going to regulate them differently than the rest of the market. What would happen? People would look at those regulations. They'd say either, I think that makes me safer as a customer, or I think it makes me more exposed. I'm going to either do all my business or none of my business. But it wouldn't make the system safer. It would simply shift and pick winners and losers in that marketplace. Same thing. Look at products. Look at money market funds, one of the favorite topics of this panel, I'm sure. If the solution that the SEC came up with for money market funds was take the largest two money market funds, or the largest three, or the largest five, and regulate them differently than the rest, you'd have the same analysis. Clients would say, am I better off or worse off? I want to move all my money there and make those bigger, or I want to move my money out, in which case the top five would shrink and you'd have a new top five. And this exercise would go on forever. So the problem in asset management, because it is an agency business, is the firm, I won't say we're irrelevant, probably that wouldn't go over quite well, but we're not systematically exposing anything. We have lots of products, we engage in lots of activities. Those products and activities need to be regulated system-wide. We want them to be regulated system-wide. We've called for raising the bar on liquidity risk management. The IOSCO is now finishing their guidelines on liquidity. We've talked about leverage from the very, very beginning. IOSCO is kicking off that project as well. Probably won't be done till next year. But these are really fundamental, important things. And I come back to where I started at the beginning. As a large investor investing other people's money, we want a safer system. We want a less exposed system. It's in our interest. It's in our customers' interest. So we're actually on the same side as many of the policymakers in many of these discussions. And I think it has moved in a very good direction. I think there is some fatigue because it is exhausting. If you take just Dodd-Frank alone, there are 26 1,000 pages of rulemakings. That's just Dodd-Frank. That's before you get to money markets, and this is before you get to Basel. It's before you get to all this other stuff. So think about the thousands and thousands of pages. And of course, not every word is perfect. I'd like to say even Dan Tarullo on his valedictory speech said, you know, on that Volcker rule, maybe we went a little too far. So if that's how he feels, imagine how everybody else feels. And there are places where we can snip and fix and sort of think of it as a tuck here and a tuck there without fundamentally affecting the safety, but getting rid of some of the extraneous stuff. Thank you.
So I would like either or both of the central bankers here represented to respond to what seems to be a rather clear statement, which is get your tanks off my lawn, or at least get the tanks off onto the right lawn and not the wrong lawn, and the wrong lawn is my lawn.
No, Barbara was much more subtle, but no. Let me be very clear on two things. We regulators want the development of a market-based finance, and we have seen it since the crisis. And second, we don't want to transpose the banking regulation to, let's say, asset managers, as it is by chance the example you took. There is sometimes this request from banks. You know, they say, but we have capital requirements, so you regulators should apply exactly the same capital rules to asset managers. No, it doesn't make sense. Having said that, I mentioned liquidity. For this reason, and we could debate some other examples you gave, and I'm very conscious of your commitment to a safer system. But if we have in the future a market shock, are we completely sure of the whole liquidity of the system? Is there a risk of funds run or not? I know the answer of most asset managers saying no, we have seen it in the previous financial crisis, and our investors accept risk, etc. The FSB has done a very adequate recommendation regarding that. Could we use a tool which we have used massively for banks, which is stress tests? And the recommendation of the FSB, published at the end of last year, is to develop system-wide stress tests for asset management, adapted to various market situations, to see if we are sure enough, with also the existence of gates to protect investors, etc., that liquidity would resist to a strong market test. I think it would be common interest to implement it.
Yeah, two things. I do think it's important if you end up with phenomena that look like banking, eventually you have to get a banking license. So you have to sort of show that you're not a bank, and then it's okay not to be a bank. But having said that, and now I'm not talking from a strictly sort of regulatory framework perspective, is that when something in any such society gets really, really big, normally you end up with a risk that you cannot diversify out of the system. And that holds for hurricanes, forest fires, whatnot. And if that happens, one way or the other, the public sector tends to get involved in some form, because there's no other way of solving the problem if you end up with a huge problem. So one just has to keep an eye on what's going on, but that's not saying that every financial sector activity is a bank. There are certainly other ways of doing things as well.
Barbara, would you like to respond briefly?
Right. So I think the whole system-wide stress test is a very important issue. If you look at mutual funds are maybe 20% of the universe of investments. If you look at asset managers, it's maybe a third of the universe, and it depends on whose numbers you look at, but that's a pretty good ballpark. That means 2/3 of the assets are managed by somebody else. They're managed by pension plans, sovereign wealth funds, insurers, sometimes individuals on their own. The problem with a system-wide stress test that only looks at mutual funds is by definition, it's not system-wide. It's only 20%. That's not really very helpful. So the models that have been proposed by the Bank of England, we've looked at, and they are much too many assumptions based on the limited sample. One of the things that I've suggested people look at is, even if it was at very gross aggregates, if we were to take the modeling behavior of what does a typical property and casualty asset allocation look like? What is a typical life insurance? What is a typical sovereign wealth fund? How about public pension plans? Defined contribution plans, which are actually counter-cyclical in how they're managed. So we can take these gross aggregates, we can put some numbers, we know the size of these categories, we can look at modeling, how do they behave, and put that into the mix. Then we've got a different discussion. But looking only at 20%, it doesn't tell you anything because you don't know how the other people around them are behaving. And that, I think, is the crux of the dialogue right now.
But since you will have to go in about 2 minutes, right? As I understand. Can I ask you one final question? And then, because I think it's one that many people will be interested in. You don't have much time, but there's been a lot of concern over recent years, now abating, about the state of the Eurozone banking sector. And there's certainly a very substantially greater optimism now. Even problems in Italy, people feel, are now being fixed. So, addressing here an audience, many of whom are not from Europe, tell them how wonderful it is. Or not.
Martin, I love your naive questions, but you are very naive, I know it. To give perhaps some facts and figures, because it's the best answer to your question. There has been significant progress in the health of the banking sector in Europe. Obviously, we are all conscious there has been and there are still some difficult cases, less and less due to the last evolution in Spain with the resolution of Banco Popular and the solution of several banks in Italy. But you shouldn't judge the banking sector in Europe only after these difficult cases, and again there are less and less. If you look at the banking sector as a whole, the solvency ratio has increased dramatically since 2012 from 9 to about 15%. We have completed the banking union, and there is no doubt that we have, with the SSM, a very powerful and single supervisor. And we are now addressing, you have seen it probably last week, an issue for the future NPLs, so in order to avoid any repetition of such crises, with rules for provisioning NPLs, which are quite demanding, but which we agreed in the ECB and which we published for consultation. So I wouldn't say that all problems are solved, but I have no doubt that we are on the right path and that the financial sector, in average, is sound. Can I have a specific word as French governor? Of course. I am perhaps allowed to. I would say that in my country, and you are probably conscious about that, banks are among the most solid in Europe and in the G7. I belong to the few governors, and happy ones, who didn't have to demand taxpayers' money for their banks. We have been very active in supervising them, and they have at present a situation of solvency and liquidity which is satisfying. We should never get asleep. Supervisors are always awake, but in the case of France, the banking sector is clearly a strength.
Not to come up with a contrarian view, because everything that Francois has just touched on is fine, but just let me add one angle to it. Europe in my view, has certainly focused on doing things slowly.
Just to show that we can have, I agree for the specific cases I mentioned, but again, there are quite different situations among banks and among countries. And if you look at the average, it's now very satisfying and comparable to other jurisdictions. I agree that in some cases, it's the only nuance, Stefan, I would introduce. In some European cases, it has gone too slowly. No, but this is not the same story, because we are speaking, and here, Stefan, we will probably agree, on banks, if we look at their balance sheet or assets, which are probably between 5 and 10% of the overall story.
So, Axel, you were going to say something about the discussion with Barbara, and then perhaps you could, I'd be very interested in your perspective, since this is a very European panel, on this European issue.
So first I wanted to say that we're not a European bank, we're a Swiss bank. And so we have been not slow. We've been the fastest in adjusting to the new standards. We were the first to have a capital ratio that was 14%. We were in the same ballpark as US banks, not having been there before. And so I think if you put stability, sustainability, and that in the core, well-capitalized banks now actually have a market advantage. Because if you're in our business with wealth management and looking after people's money, believe me, those people don't want sleepless nights because they worry about your capitalization. So being solidly financed is part of our business model. And I think some European banks have been, I agree with Stefan, slow in adjusting to the new realities. First, I think there was some illusion that the old realities would come back, so it delayed some of the adjustment. And when people started to realize that the world has changed for good, they actually had to adjust in a market environment that was much less favorable, as if you've done the same transformation in 2011-12, directly after the financial crisis and after the major re-regulation. So I do agree with Stefan, without pointing finger to any particular institutions, that European banks on average have been slower. But then having said that, US banks weren't fast by desire. They were fast because the Fed forced them at gunpoint to take capital and only allowed them to pay it back when they felt that the banks were safer. So some of the speed that was produced here wasn't sort of produced because of really deep private sector insight. It was done by a very different regulatory approach. And my view at the time, I was still in the official sector, was in the US, public money initially to take away the doubt about the stability of the system was a kiss of life. In Europe, public money was a kiss of death. These institutions had to change. They winded down institutional business. They had to do compensation for competitive advantages that they gained. So the whole philosophy was different. And I think when you look at the results, Europe or now, and Martin, you implied that by your question, it is actually showing that proactive changes, probably even better if done by the institutions themselves rather than being forced by the regulator, has been the key for success in coming out of the crisis at a speed that is not there. Now, the other point I wanted to intervene about was the one, look, just to be very clear, we banks don't want asset managers and insurance businesses to be regulated as systemic institutions. What Barbara said is very clear. Activity-based regulation, in my view, is the way to go. Same activities, same regulation. That was the mantra when I was still there in the Toronto meetings in the official sector. However, given that we started with that, we haven't quite ended with that because, I mean, you talked about the tank on Barbara's loan. If that loan is in front of a bank, it's a different issue. Same activity in a bank versus in an asset manager, different regulation. And so when we go back and look at whether actually the concept of a systemic bank at the global level and us being universal banks that combine 4 or 5 business lines, I think it is really important to take a deeper drill down in what is it actually that the bank is doing. And I can tell you, when I compare us, a global wealth manager with a strong asset management arm and a small home market in retail and corporate business, we're a totally different animal than some of the other global banks who have a completely different mix of business. And I think as regulation evolves, regulation will have to be tailored to match the specific features of financial institutions rather than judging all institutions across the board by the size of their balance sheet or by the types of risk. If you judge them by the types of risk, it's a much better place to go. And just to sort of a last remark on what Barbara said, I fully agree. Look, the likelihood of a setback or unwinding of regulation, this side of the Atlantic or the other side of the Atlantic, is very, very low. I don't think you will get the majorities and the processes in place to do a repeal act of existing regulatory rules. What you will get is a more intelligent fine-tuning of the rules so that for the same amount of stability or without compromising stability, you can get a much more effective way of running the balance sheet of a bank or other institutions. And I think that is worthwhile looking into. And I welcome both Treasury papers that basically say, look, on some areas, it's not that we've gone too far or we haven't gone far enough. We've taken some choices that if you look at them again and allow the industry to deliver similar stability, maybe with a different set of constellations, there are rooms for improvement. And that's how I look at the debate that is now taking place. And I think it's a debate we need to have, because if that doesn't happen, my first fear, namely it won't get implemented in a meaningful way across the Atlantic, is going to come in, and that's probably not the place we want to end up in.
Issues, because we've had a wonderful discussion, but this is a very important set of issues. So, Barbara, if you have a last word on how mean they are to asset managers.
No, not that at all. Actually, I was going to you just elaborate slightly on Axel's point. If you take that Volcker rule as an example, in isolation, you might say, oh, this is a good idea because it's going to prevent a bank from using insured deposits to take certain kinds of risks in proprietary trading. That was the original concept. The reality is 950 pages later of gobbledygook, and I'm not a bank, so it's not my problem, but I look at it. It's full of exceptions and comma here and comma there, and you can't even follow it. The bank supervisors can't follow it. And if you take it out of context, maybe it's okay. But if you then put it in the context of all the other regulation, including the U.S. gold plating a lot of Basel, you sort of say, do you even need this thing? And that's the discussion going on right now with even people like Governor Powell and Chair Yellen. I mean, like a lot of people who are very serious regulators are saying, maybe we did go too far.
I thought maybe I shouldn't. I don't think I've done this before, but I'll tell a story which is actually relevant because very briefly I was sort of semi in the official sector. Namely, for a year I was a member of the Independent Commission on Banking in the UK, and we were asked to look at structural reform of British banking. And we ended up, as probably everybody knows, with ring-fencing the retail banking. I'm not going to go into that further. It's a British solution for a British problem, though I think it's relevant elsewhere, and I stand by it. But at one point, we decided to look very, very carefully at the Volcker rule. And we had the proponent of the rule come and talk to us for several hours. And you will notice we did not adopt the Volcker rule because we anticipated, and were right, I think, exactly the problems you defined. And we didn't think it was a very good idea. So there was a reason we ended up where we did end up and didn't adopt that idea. I don't think we've said that before, but anyway, it wasn't an accident. We looked at it carefully and decided it was a seriously bad idea. Now, let me move on now to a few other questions, and I'd like to start with you, if I may, Stefan. Even in the previous panel, as I went in, there's been a discussion of new risks, or risks other than the risk we have been focusing on the good principle that lightning tends to strike somewhere else. So one of the sets of risks that people are very concerned about, and I'd be interested in your perspective on these sets of risks, relate to technology. And they relate in two quite different ways. One is the whole cybersecurity issue, and the other is the potential for the transformation of financial systems in an untoward and unanticipated way by fintech. And on both of which I followed to the extent I can. I'd be very interested in yours and others' perspective on the nature of those risks and whether they're serious and whether they're being handled in a coherent way.
These, you raised two very different issues, but they're sort of interrelated.